Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and oftentimes when we refer or talk about Macedonians, whether it be famous people like their leaders, Alexander the Great, King Philip, General Ptolemy, or their dynasty, or the people, we tend to refer to them as Macedonians/Greeks. In other words, we use the terms interchangeably. So the question that I have for you today has to do with ethnogenesis. Is the nomenclature correct when we use it interchangeably? Today's video has to do with the ethnogenesis of the Macedonians, so we could say that it's another episode of the dedicated series. We have talked about ancient Greek ethnogenesis, we have talked about the ancient Romans. Today it's Macedonia. The ethnopoiesis of the Macedonian people has been the fulcre of quite a lot of scholarly debate over the years. Moreover, in recent decades, modern national politics got involved. Today, we will not be doing any politics here, and we will look at the evidence to simply and correctly answer this question based on the interpretation of the ancient sources and contextualize data analysis. Thus, this study will adopt a multidisciplinary approach, weaving together historical text, epigraphic data, material culture, and historiographical analysis to assess the legitimacy of the Macedonians' inclusion within the Hellenistic world. The goal is not merely to classify them, but to understand the processes by which identity was asserted, contested, and mythologized from antiquity to the present. Furthermore, in order to answer this question thoroughly, we'll have to address three specific elements: their language, their culture, and territorial ties. Some argue that among the first records regarding ancient Macedonian history, the epic poem Iliad written by Homer should be mentioned. There is a people named Paionians from Wide Axios and a couple of interesting toponyms, one of which is Emathia. This name will be overridden by the name Macedon, so a tie could be possible. As a general frame of reference for the next section, we're going to move into the examination of the ancient sources, as who better than the ancients to tell us what the Macedonians actually were. Already in the different variants of the myth of Macedon, both Hesiod and Hellanicus implicitly indicate that the Macedonians are of Greek stock, closely related in fact to the Aeolians. Even Herodotus does not seem to have doubts regarding the Greekness of the Macedonians, who, according to him, however, are not of Aeolic stock. Herodotus tells us that the Macedonians was the name that had been acquired by those Dorians who in very remote times had settled at the foot of the Pindus mountain chain near the Orestis. We'll come back to that toponym later. Alright, let's confirm this by jumping into the actual sources. From Herodotus book 156 we read, "But the Dorians on the contrary have been constantly on the move. Their home in Deucalion's reign was Pythiotis, and in the reign of Dorus, son of Hellen, the country known as Histiaeotis, in the neighborhood of Ossa and Olympus. Driven from there by the Cadmeians, they settled in Pindus, and were known as Macedons. Thence they migrated to Dryopis and finally to Peloponnese, where they got their present name of Dorians." Justin also gives us some interesting information, check this out. Caranus, the first Macedon king, came to Emathia with a large band of Greeks, being instructed by an oracle to seek a home in Macedonia. Returning to Herodotus' histories, we find this. The Macedonians made away with all that, as well as with all the envoys themselves. No long time afterwards, the Persians made a great search for these men, but Alexander had cunning enough to put an end to it by the gift of a great sum and his own sister, Gigaia, to Berberis, a Persian, and the general of those who were looking for the slain men. It was in this way, then, that the death of these Persians was kept silent. Now that these descendants of Perdica are Greeks, as they themselves say, I must have chance to know. Now we will come back to more sources that help us identify the Macedonians as a people and also their movements throughout the land. But now I would like to open a brief parenthesis on the mythology of it. According to Hesiod, the ancestor of the Macedonians, Macedon, was the son of the god Zeus and Thea. According instead to Hellanicus, he was the son of Aeolus, the ancestor of the Aeolians, who, together with the Achaeans, Dorians, and Ionians, formed the four Greek tribes. According instead to Theopompus, a Greek historian and rhetorician, the first king of the Macedonians would have been Caranus, son of Temenus, the Doric king of the city of Argos, who would have left his paternal city when, after the monarch's death, a succession war would have broken out among his sons. Marcisas of Pella, another Greek historian, appears to share the same parameters when it comes to the history and mythology of it. According to the myth, Caranus would have relied on a prophecy of the oracle of Delphi, according to which he would find his new kingdom in a place particularly rich in fauna, and therefore, in his wanderings, he would have followed the tracks left by a herd of goats. There are different varieties of this myth. Either Caranus would have founded his city in Argead, which is in Macedonia. 2, he could have conquered it by taking it from natives. Or once again, he may have received it as a gift from the king of the Orestis region, in exchange for military support. And if we were to believe the second one, then the original name of the town would have been Edessa. Polybius, whom we often read on this channel, is the next author who appears to have no doubts whatsoever upon the Greekness of the Macedonians. Theotis was the country in which the Hellenes dwelt, but under Dorus, the son of Hellen, they moved to the tract at the base of Ossa and Olympus, which is called Histiaiotis. Forced to retire from the region by the Cadmeians, they settled under the name of Macedni, in the chain of Pindus. Hence, they once removed and came to Dryopis, and from Dryopis, having entered the Peloponnese in this way, they became known as Dorians. Now that we have spent some time to see how the Greeks saw the Macedonians, let's have a look at how the Persians describe them. From an external eye, that of the Persians indeed, the Macedonians are Greeks. Once again, Greek. On the inscriptions of Darius I's mausoleum, the population subdued by the great king are enumerated, among which, as far as the West is concerned, we have Scythians, Thracians, and Greeks, or rather, how they call it, Iauna, transliterated as Ionians. In Darius's inscriptions, however, just as the Scythians are distinguished into 3 groups, pointed hat Scythians, Scythians who drink hauma, that is, soma, the sacred drink, and Scythians beyond the sea, the Iauna, which as we described, where the Ionians are distinguished into Iauna, the Iauna Takabara, and the Iauna with a hat like a shield. Scholars have interpreted this as a reference to the kausia, the characteristic rounded headgear of the Macedonians. The Persians are indeed an external observer, perhaps incapable of grasping substantial differences between foreign people, yet they not only prove capable of distinguishing between the different ethnicities of the Scythians, but also of identifying the Ghetto-Thracians as a separate ethnos. Therefore, there is almost no doubt that these are specifically Macedonians and that they are considered a subcategory of Greeks and Ionians. Let's now move into the material good with a little bit of archaeology. Let's talk about the accursed tablets at Pella. In 1986 at Pella, a lead scroll with magical inscriptions was found, the so-called katadesmos, essentially a sort of evil eye and love spell. The Pella tablet is the richest example we have of ancient Macedonian, meaning the language, and years of analysis and research have allowed, with a certain margin of safety, to identify the matrix of the language. In light of the most recent studies, several academics, including the historian Miltiades Atsopoulos and the linguist Claude Brixey, in particular, tend to identify Macedonian as a peculiar Greek dialect, with characteristic elements of Northwestern Doric and some reminiscences of Aeolic languages. This language was a bit of an amalgam, which was probably created, at least according to these linguists and historians, in the Orestis, during the ethnogenesis of the Macedonians. The fact that at the base of Macedonian as a language there were 2 branches of Greek, namely Doric and Aeolic, which were considered barbaric to the ears of those who spoke Attic dialects, is probably not a coincidence, but we will explore this further later. Yet Macedonian as a language was quite unique throughout Hellas. For example, linguists identify the presence within Macedonian of terms which are traceable to Illyrian and Thracian languages, both due to proximity to these peoples and, particularly in the case of Thracian languages, from the fact that already with Alexander I, the Kingdom of Macedonia had incorporated territories inhabited by Thracian tribes like the Mygdones, the Edonians, and the Bryges. And it's not by chance that in the east of Axios, even in the Macedonian era, the presence of Thracian-type onomastics persists. This geographical proximity to Thracians, Paeonians, and Illyrians, together with the peripherality with respect to the Greece of the polis, must have further increased a certain sense of otherness, at least from the perspective of the Athenians, which we will review later on the video. This sort of mental attitude that some Greeks, such as the Athenians, may have had towards the Macedonians, however, has nothing to do with ethnicity, but it's rather fueled by other elements, such as the subsistence of a monarchical regime that was rooted in the traditions of the most archaic Greece, not to mention a form of monumental and funerary art that could be indebted both to the Mycenaean and, up to a certain extent, to some Thracian customs. What this means is that the answer when it comes to the Macedonians' ethnicity and ethnogenesis and their belonging when it comes to Greek identity is nuanced. On one hand, the Macedonians were a Greek people, but even within the Greek world, they still maintain their own uniqueness and regional variety. Having established this, let's now talk about a different possible legend that has to do with their beginning. Another line of interpretation wants to trace the beginning of the Macedonian people to the city of Argos, at least when it comes to the ruling house. According to the legend, there were 3 brothers, descendants of King Temenus, who would have been exiled from Argos and after taking refuge in Illyria would have moved to Macedonia, putting themselves at the service of the local monarch. The myth that would have the Macedonian ruling house of Argead origin, called precisely Argead or Temenid, is very interesting, but we don't know if it's the result of a superimposition of different later elements. Regardless, the author who repeatedly reaffirms the Greek origins of the Argeads is indeed, as we said, Herodotus. Indeed, he reports that Alexander I presents himself to the Persian ambassadors as the Hellenic governor of the Macedonians, and that he then justifies his support for the Greek coalition during the Second Persian War by being Hellegenos, of Hellenic stock and origin. Finally, Alexander I will be judged Hellenic by the same magistrates who decide who can and cannot participate in the Olympics, despite those who would have wanted to exclude him because he was Macedonian. But Herodotus is not the only one to report the Greek origins of the Macedonian ruling house. Aeschines, Greek statesman and Athenian orator, defines Amyntas III, Philip II's father, as, once again, Hellenic, and Thucydides, who is an Athenian historian and general, reaffirms the origin of the Argeads from the Temenids of Argos. Finally, Socrates indicates Philip II as a man of Greek blood, emphasizing that Argos is his ancestral homeland. Before we continue, I think we need to go a little deeper when it comes to the myth that designs or marks as the land of ancestral origin of the Macedonians, the Orestis. The Orestis is a region of Upper Macedonia, currently located in West Macedonia, Greece. This origin myth, which would place the Macedonian monarchs as coming directly from the Orestis, is recognized by the Hellanodikai, the magistrates who decided precisely who could participate in the Olympics and who could not. We have to keep in mind that the original homeland of the Argeads was not so much Argos in the Argolid, but much more probably the center of Argos, Orestikon, which is located precisely in the Orestis. Consequently, the ruling house of Macedonia, from a strictly ethnic point of view, was not constituted by elements that differed from the people it governed, and while being distinctive and unique in its fabric, retaining political institution, peculiar dialects and ritual forms, both the people and the ruling house were Greeks. After this voyage and journey that we spent with sources and iconographic evidence, analysis of material goods, how do we explain then the fact that, at least in some verses, the Macedonians are in fact indicated as barbarians? There are a few figures in ancient Greece, particularly belonging to the Athenian world, such as Demosthenes and Pericles, who do reiterate a few times that the Macedonians were barbarians. And according to some contemporary scholars, this attitude should be sought more than anything in the propaganda of a certain Athenian political party that did not look favorably upon Philip's II hegemonic claims. Yet even Isocrates, who is favorable to the sovereign, while on one hand he presents the tradition that would have had the Macedonians to be of Argeads or Greek origin, on the other hand he does still seem to imply a certain barbaric nature. Last but not least, we have Thrasymachus of Chalcedon, Greek sophist, who calls the Macedonian king Archaeolus, once again, a barbarian. In order for us to fully understand this apparent contradiction between those sources that name them as clearly Greeks and those thinkers, sophists and historians who instead consider them barbarians, we have to look at these words in context. Athenian orators like Demosthenes labeled Philip as barbarian, but this was a rhetorical move meant to delegitimize Macedonian political claims and preserve the cultural boundaries of Hellenism. Nonetheless, the Macedonian elite made deliberate efforts to Hellenize their public image to counter this slander. Philip sponsored Pan-Hellenic festivals, claimed Heraclid descent, patronized Greek intellectuals, and as we know, Alexander went even further, presenting himself as a world monarch in the mold of Achilles or Dionysius, spreading Greek language and culture as part of a civilizing mission. But the ultimate proof that can clear the way and absolutely demonstrate that this was not an actual fair representation of the Macedonians as barbarian, but it was nothing more than slander, rhetorical and propagandistic move, is in Plato's words. According to Plato, for example, the language spoken on the island of Lesbos, an Aeolic dialect, was a barbaric language. According to Hesychius, Greek grammarian, instead, the Eleans of the northwestern Peloponnese who spoke a Doric dialect are, once again, barbarian. In this perspective, the fact that according to at least some Greeks, specifically the one in the Attic context, some other Greeks would be considered as barbarian, particularly in the way they spoke, help us define this word, barbarian, giving it a very relative weight. In other words, if you think that Macedonians are barbarians and not Greek because of the way some Athenians described them, then you should also think that Aeolians, Ionic, and Dorians were not Greeks either, which would be insane. When it comes to the ancient Macedonian language, no full text remains, and what scholars have had to do was to piece together approximately 100 to 200 glosses, isolated words, identified in ancient lexicons or inscriptions as, in fact, Macedonian. These fragments, recorded by grammarians like Hesychius and Pollux, are difficult to interpret and are often transmitted through layers of Greek redaction. With that being said, current scholarly consensus articulates Macedonian as a Greek dialect, possibly the most archaic and conservative form of northwestern Greek. Inscriptions from the Macedonian kingdom, particularly under the Antigonid dynasty, are overwhelmingly Greek, a testament to the region's elite Hellenicization. Although we have to keep in mind that the choice of script and language in official documents may reflect a political strategy, rather than the authentic vernacular spoken by the lower classes too. As such, this linguistic evidence is interesting, but not conclusive. Plutarch is the one to let us know that during the quarrel that would tragically conclude with the assassination of Cletus by Alexander the Great, the Macedonian monarch, seized by rage, would have called out loudly in the Macedonian language to his personal guard. And again, the Macedonian idiom would have been used by Alexander's soldiers to welcome the Greek general Eumenes of Cardia, who, on the other hand, when he found himself in the necessity of having to parley with the Macedonian Neoptolemus, would have used as an intermediary a messenger named Senias, who, in one of the Oxyrhynchus papyri attributed to Arrian, is defined as speaking Macedonian. Quintus Curtius Rufus, Roman historian, finally reports that during the trial of Philotas, accused of having taken part in a conspiracy against Alexander, the general would have chosen to defend himself speaking in Greek and not in Macedonian, this to be understood by most of those present. From this anecdote, we can understand that even though Macedonians could understand other Greeks would have had some trouble understanding spoken Macedonian. The final picture that we can draw for our conclusion, even though we're still missing some pieces, is to me quite categorical. The ancient Macedonians were absolutely Greeks, although in their own way they were regionally unique from a linguistic, cultural, political and military standpoint. Of course, as always, do let me know if I missed out some references or some sources, and let me know what you think in the comments below. Were the ancient Macedonians Greek or were they barbarians? Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much.